not seeing you all in person. It's the first time I've spoken to Old Berwick online, and it's well, let's just say I kind of miss those good old days of, because many of you know, for pretty much every October for over a decade, I would give an annual, like usually October update on the last season's Chadbourne dig. And I don't know, I was trying to count how many talks I've given at Old Berwick over the years, but it's got to be well over 20. And so amazingly, yeah, Carrie, we actually came up with one that I've never given before here, but you will see some elements to this because I will be talking a bit about some really interesting finds from the Chadbourne site. So I guess in keeping with the sort of Halloween spirit, this is a talk on counter magic and protective magic in early New England, talking about architectural and archaeological examples of this. It really is, it's a growing discipline. It's something as in, frankly, English scholars, architectural historians, and archaeologists are probably 2 or 3 decades ahead of us in the amount of sophisticated work that's been done there. But essentially, the growing amount of evidence, even in America, is impressive.
Right. You know what I'm going to do?
For the
go to the.
Whoop, mute yourselves, please, there, if you would.
Can I put the TV on real low?
Real low.
Anyhow, I think you'll see that Americans, we make a lot of progress in this, but essentially, I honestly feel that probably most houses around here and most archaeology sites have some evidence of counter magic, even if it's from the 19th century, but it's just a question of actually finding it. So first off, just some definitions. There are really 2 types of magic: white magic and black magic. Black magic or maleficent magic, basically people in theory in league with Satan to cause harm to people. And then white magic, which is used to help people. And if you're not familiar with the concept, really, you actually are, because I'm sure, I hope that everyone here has seen The Wizard of Oz at some time or another. I've actually, occasionally every year, I have one student who has not seen it, but I would hope most older folk have seen it. And of course, it's like a typical American movie where the good people are dressed in white and the bad people are dressed in black, and in this case, in green face, right? We have this stereotype of the Wicked Witch of the West, the ugly hag, and Glinda, the good witch of the North, who dresses in white and shimmering gowns and is here to help Dorothy find her way home and give her a beautiful pair of, well, of course, in the original book, they're silver slippers, which it's actually a parable for the populist movement. We won't get into that, but when you have a color movie, you had to have ruby slippers. But anyhow, you get this idea is that magic could help, but also harm. There's 2 sides to it. White magic tends to be performed by people who are known as cunning folk, cunning men, or cunning women. And they could do a variety of different things to try to help you. They could try to use divination to lost objects, tell people's fortunes. They would carry out sometimes magical healing and even counter magic, using magic against evil forces, against witches. Maybe one of the more common types that people don't even think about is a Ouija board, which is actually a more modern version of divination of the sieve and shears method, where you would take an old pair of shears and a meal sieve and balance them with fingers and then ask it a question, in whichever way that it fell would give you your answer, yes or no. So again, essentially like a Ouija board with this same kind of way to, shall we say, game the system, one might say, right? And frankly, there are some homes in America, devout people who refuse to let a Ouija board in their house because you are, in theory, communing with darker forces. Because the problem is this is still magic, right? I mean, all magic is basically evil because you're invoking Satan, right? God does not work in magic. Christianity is a supplicative religion. You pray to God, hoping that your prayers will be answered, but there are no guarantees. As opposed to magic, if you follow the proper, well, Harry Potter, the proper incantation and the proper flick of the wrist as you wave your wand, it will happen. And that is because Satan is answers to those magical solutions. But the problem is, again, even if it's white magic, ministers and divines and really God-fearing folk in colonial New England and elsewhere had serious reservations about even white magic because, again, you're communing with Satan. And so there's this sort of like this magical world that exists, kind of folk magic, that people kind of, and you'll see examples of that you take for granted, that is folk magic that we've all kind of used, but that, again, the local minister would probably not be happy with because it basically is calling on darker forces, even if for good purposes. Countermagic really is the finding and warding off of evil, for one thing. You use magic against magic. And a classic example of this from Salem, of course, is the site of the, took place right here at the site of the Salem Village Parsonage in what's now Danvers. Actually, if you come in off of the Center Street exit off of 95, you go right by this site. There's a small sign marking it. And in 1692, when Reverend Parris and his wife were out at Thursday evening lecture in a neighboring town, a neighboring meeting house, Mary Sibley, their neighbor, comes and looks after the children, and she instructs John and perhaps Tito, but it's unclear if it's both of them or one of them, the accounts differ, to bake a witch cake. And what they do is they bake this witch cake, and they said, by diabolical means was used by making of a cake by my Indian man, who had his direction from our sister Mary Sibley, since which apparitions have been aplenty and exceedingly much, and thus the devil hath been raised. Now, Parris's daughter and niece had been afflicted for over a month, and clearly Satan was in their midst. He would have known this. But now, conveniently, Mary Sibley has given an excuse to say, well, there was nothing wrong with my kids until basically you invoked Satan by baking this witch cake. Now, poor Mary Sibley was using folk magic to have this cake made to try to detect who the witch was. And it works. I'm actually thinking this would be something, one of these days with my students, I'm going to bring in a witch's cake and then talk about it and serve it. I don't think at which point no one will want to eat it. But the idea is there's a kind of a weird colonial science to it, shall we say, right? And that is, if you take the urine of the afflicted person who's afflicted by a witch, when a witch casts a spell, some of that witch's essence is in the spell and enters the victim. Think of it in some ways almost like electrical wave, invisible sort of wave or radio wave, right? But then when the afflicted person urinates, again, some of the witch's essence comes out in the urine. So if you take that urine and you bake it up into a rye cake and maybe have some other odd things into it, like maybe the fingernail clippings from you or from your family dog or what have you, all kinds of local recipes, and frankly, none of them particularly appetizing. You bake that cake and then you feed it to the dog. And when the dog chews on the cake, that witch's essence in the urine will be harmed, will be hurt by the dog, and the witch will come running into the house screaming. So the first person who comes into the house after the dog eats the witch cake, you see, they say, aha, there's the witch coming to stop the pain, you see. So again, a weird science of the 17th century. And this is used by Reverend Parris to say, look, we were doing just fine, Mary, until you did this. So thank you for nothing. That's just one example of many of counter magic being used. Another really good example of this is image magic, the use of poppets. And, remember Mrs. Doubtfire, hello, puppets, poppets really an English term for little children, but also a term for dolls, for small miniature dolls. And of course, this is what we tend to think of as voodoo, right? Where if you take a doll and perhaps get a lock of someone's hair and put it on it, or a piece of one of their clothing, it takes on the essence of the person who's going to be the victim. But this is not voodoo. This is perfectly good English magic, right? And then if you want to get that person, you take the doll and you stab it with a knife or a pin, and that person, even if they're 10 miles away, feels pain. And there actually have been some poppets found like inside the walls of houses from the 17th and 18th century. And these two were actually found on a late 17th century house on Long Island. And they're actually illustrated in Bob St. George's book, Conversing by Sign. So the interesting thing about image magic is it's used for both evil and good. In 1692, Bridget Bishop was the first person, not the first person to be accused of witchcraft, but the first to be tried, in large part because the evidence was so strong against her, because it included this deposition by John Bly and his son William, who deposed that a number of years before they'd been employed by Bridget Bishop to do some work and to repair her cellar. And as they were taking down the wall of the cellar of the old house, the deponents found in the holes of said house, walls belonging to the cellar, found several poppets made up of rags with hog's bristles and with headless pins pinned in them with the points outward. So in other words, a doll, a poppet that has pins stuck into it to harm the victim, whoever it was, and they found it in the holes in her basement. Now, of course, this was what, like a number of years ago, 7 years last past. And no, they didn't produce the poppets, but the idea clearly was that Bridget was using poppets to harm people, in keeping with the other evidence against her, that she was using image magic to get back at some of her victims. And some of the other depositions talk about her going to her neighbors, the Shaddocks, and asking them to dye these really tiny pieces of clothing that would be so too small to be useful for anything except for a doll. The idea being, of course, that maybe she's making a doll to harm people, a poppet. So on the other hand, too, though, people could use poppets as counter magic. Anne Higginson Dolliver, the daughter of Reverend John Higginson, the Salem minister, in 1692 is accused of witchcraft. And one thing she's accused of is having poppets. And they specifically, on trial, they ask her, does she in fact have poppets? And in the end, she ends up that she owned 2 poppets, and it was because she thought she was bewitched, and that she had read in a book that told her that the way to afflict them that had afflicted her was with poppets, right? So I'm going to get that witch before she gets me. And she's very, very open and honest in this. I will also say that Reverend Higgins later laments that his daughter, I believe, I can't remember if he refers to as being of simplish mind or of addled, but basically probably not the smartest Puritan in Salem to be bragging about the fact that she has poppets, regardless, in the middle of a witch hunt, even if she allegedly was using them for a good purpose. Because again, there really is no good purpose for white magic. You're still committing an offense against God by invoking the powers of Satan. Another type of counter magic is apotropaic magic, which is really from the Greek term to ward off, and is often used to protect houses from demons. And here you see an illustration from Joseph Glanville's wonderful work, Sedissimus Triumphatus, which is a 1681 account of witchcraft and how to prevent it. And you can see in the engraving here, a flying demon trying to fly in through the attic window into a house. You know, I often think that we're lucky that these demons had such limited powers and weren't too bright, that they obviously couldn't get through walls. They had to try to find a window that might be open to get in, which makes one question the efficacy of demonology in general, right? But I love this illustration. So houses were particularly vulnerable. Windows, doors, chimneys, any openings had to be protected from possible assault by the supernatural world. Another way to protect your house would be by bay leaves or evergreen boughs placed strategically around the foundation of the house to keep evil out, or perhaps near the chimney. And there's a great example of this actually in Hampton, New Hampshire, which had several rounds of witchcraft accusations, largely against Eunice Cole, who was accused 3 times between the 1650s and the 1680s. But in 1680, another one who's accused is Rachel Fuller. And they talk about the fact that Rachel, they thought, was a strange old lady and might be a witch. And so they start laying out sweet bay around under the thresholds of the front and back door of the house, and entirely under the back door of the house, which is the way she always entered the house, and halfway around the breadth of the front door. And sure enough, as soon as Rachel comes to the house the next time, she avoids the back door, which has the bay leaves scattered completely over it. And then she tries to force her way through the part of the front door that doesn't have bay leaves on it, and ends up sort of leaving in disgust, at which point they are convinced that she must be a witch, because you see she was warded off by the bay leaves. Other times they'll surround foundations or put under thresholds yew or other greenery. And again, if you think about in the sort of the medieval world, this idea of trees that actually remained green all year seem to have some kind of supernatural power to them. And again, going back to trees back into early medieval days where yew in particular were considered to have somewhat magical powers because of that, right? Other forms of protective magic on houses included, well, if you think the witch cake was kind of odd, how about a witch's bottle? And I talk about this in The Devil of Great Island, where the Walton Tavern, this besotted Quaker tavern on Great Island, present-day Newcastle, by the way, right around somewhere near where the elementary school is on Great Island today in Newcastle. The Waltons' home is supernaturally assaulted by a lithobolia, a stone-throwing demon, for months on end throughout the summer of 1682. And finally, the Quaker owners, George and Alice Walton, try to use counter magic. And they set a fire on the fire a pot with urine and crooked pins with it designed to have a boil, and by that means to give punishment to the witch or wizard. They try to boil this liquor, which they will actually bottle up. And as soon as they do this, the stone-throwing demon lobs a rock down the chimney, which cracks the pot they're cooking it in, and they start it again. In this case, the pot completely breaks, and you have this hot boiling urine all over the hearth of the kitchen, at which point I think that this would have warded off a lot more than evil. Like anybody in the neighborhood would said, no thanks, we're staying out of the Walton's place. So this was kind of a relatively common practice that is actually written up in a few different places. But what they're describing here is a witch's bottle. You would take this concoction, and it could include a number of things. It usually included nails or bent pins, sometimes pins stuck into a piece of felt in the shape of the heart, sometimes maybe some urine of the afflicted, some mixed in with their hair, sometimes even fingernail clippings or the nails of a dog. And those would be boiled up and then corked into a bottle. In England in particular, they are put in these rather fearsome looking German stoneware bottles known as Bartmann bottles, bearded man bottles, or Bellarmine bottles. And ideally, they are then buried under the hearth. You pull up the bricks and bury this under the hearth, which is where archaeologists tend to find them. And they're basically protecting evil spirits from coming down the chimney. And again, once your pot boils over with this stuff, you're in the house against other things as well too. And this is an example of one. Again, there have been literally probably a few dozen of these found in different English contexts. Here's one you can see that is actually still filled with urine and hand-forged nails, where they did an X-ray of it from Greenwich, England. Also, human urine, brimstone, nails, brass pins, possible navel fluff. So there's no rhyme or reason necessarily to us in this stuff, and one wishes one had put down the rhyme or reason as to what they put into it. And I have yet to find an American or heard of a finding of an American 17th century bottle like this. There are some later examples, even into the 19th century, though, of what we believe are witches' bottles, and I'll actually show you an exhibit of one. I'll show you one from Elliott, Maine, later in the talk. So when I started doing archaeology at the Chadbourne site, I was relatively ignorant of this stuff. And because again, 25 years ago, American archaeologists really weren't on top of this. But then we started to find some really interesting thing at the Chadbourne dig and started sort of researching them, and we're able to put things together and made much more sense out of some of the things we were finding. And, this is the thing is, of course, a lot of this somewhat is conjecture. To what degree can we prove such things as opposed to what does it appear to be? But there's some really interesting patterns. So the Chadbourne site, the main house here is a 30 by 42-foot house with an 18-foot addition off the end. The main core built in 1664, the addition completed sometime before the place was destroyed in the Salmon Falls raid in March of 1690. There are other buildings as a part of this complex as well too, but the most important piece here is this main building, particularly the areas where the doors were. That circle right there shows you where the side door was. We found now remember the place burned down, but where that doorway had been, we found the padlock for that door, and we also found a horseshoe. And then at the front door, we found the whole door hardware, complete with key, front door key, and door hardware, and yes, another horseshoe, and even more. Now, in this case, unfortunately, the field had been plowed, so we did not have the threshold intact. But you can see here we have the stonework just below the threshold and the cellar to the inside. So we're standing essentially ready to knock on the front door, as it were. And down in those rocks and in that area, we found all of this hardware, a horseshoe placed over, which presumably would have been placed over the door. And then in addition to that, all the door hardware, and interestingly enough, an oak tree 2-pence dated 1664. This is the only piece of New England currency that is not dated 1652, and is an interesting coin. This house we know was built in 1664. I'm sorry, this is 62, not 64. So it probably was a new coin used to bless the threshold of the house. You often find like a new coin, if available, that you put a nice shiny coin under the threshold. In cases I've actually found them under the post hole by the front door of a house, of an earth-fast house. On one side up in the Kennebec River, Lee Kramer dug. He troweling out the bottom of a post hole, it upflipped a pine tree shilling. They are also put under the mast of ships for the similar purpose, to bless the ship and give it good luck. So in this case, we found this coin dated 1662 in a house that we know from dated window leads and a dated brick that was raised in 1664. So probably the newest coin they could find with the limited silver coins available on the main frontier in the 17th century. Though ironically, actually, the silversmith John Hull did have a sawmill up the Salmon Falls a couple miles, and the family did own a spoon made by Hull and Sanderson. So they had friends in high places. But you have all of this protective magic right around the front door of this house, and in particular, the door hardware is at the front door is pretty remarkable. So it includes a number of things here. On the right here, you'll see what's known as a cock's head hinge, and the bottom quarter cock's head broke off. But what you'll see here are 4 roosters or cock's head, with his beak, with his eye, with his bill, cock's comb, and then his proud jutting chest. Many animals, including roosters, are supposed to be able to see the undead in the invisible world. Okay. Others include that they have this ability are supposedly cats and also horses, which frankly explains sometimes why you find dead mummified cats buried in walls of old houses. And yes, even sometimes horses' skulls under floorboards in houses to basically see the unseen. I've never been able to figure out what the dead horse was supposed to do with that information once he saw it, but there's the traditions. Again, no one writes this stuff down saying exactly why they did this or what. So we have to sort of read some clues, but these are common practices. And so also too, the idea would be that the rooster would sound the alarm to the household of evil trying to enter in the front door. But there are other pieces of protection here you can see all over the place, particularly if you look at the striker on this front door, and it is pretty elaborately treated here. Circles are considered counter-magical. There's circles here. And again, there's a St. Andrew's cross or saltire, which again is considered to be counter-magical. And what is it made of but a series of tiny circles? And also too, in addition to that, if you look out here, the front door key itself is made in the shape of the heart. And again, hearts are a powerful system of love, and again, really kind of a counter-magical image as well too. So in other words, this front door is just loaded for beer, or frankly, loaded for Satan, right? With all kinds of, this was the, shall we say, the ring central security system of the 17th century at the Chadbourne site. And there's the key. Now, and there's the rooster. Now, what's really fascinating is the same season that we found that threshold area and all those artifacts, we found out that the neighbors up the street who owned the Benjamin Chadbourne house, built in 1770, the Alterios, had been doing some restoration work on it. And under the threshold, their carpenters had found buried the old front door lockboard and a Liberty penny, 1800. Now, the house was built in 1770, so we know that this work was done later, and the carpenters, to one degree, may have been just marking their presence, but also, too, they are putting a penny, a relatively new penny, 1800, on the threshold, again, to bless the house. I'll bet you there was one placed there originally in 1770 that they replaced, might be my guess. So I think it's funny because, of course, this is the great-grandson of Humphrey and Lucy Chadbourne, who's carrying on that same tradition in his house, who, I really would doubt he would have known of this, that his great-grandparents' house was blessed in the same way. But this is the kind of folk knowledge that's passed down from one generation to the next. Frankly, things like our belief in horseshoes, right, which now we see as good luck, but actually goes back into medieval times. So why horseshoes? Well, iron in general is seen to contain powerful counter magic. And again, if you think of this stuff in the medieval context, iron was a pretty amazing substance, right? That again, you could pound it out and warm it up and turn it into different useful functions. But in particular, there was a folk magical story about Saint Dunstan, who was supposedly a blacksmith. And of course, think about this. The devil is cloven hoofed. So apparently the devil was in need of a new pair of shoes, of iron shoes. And he asks Dunstan to give him some new shoes. And Dunstan, being a good Christian, takes really long nails like this to put on the devil's new horseshoes, new shoes, saying, "I'll fix him." And he caused the devil such tremendous pain that apparently after that, the devil, whenever he saw the horseshoe, would run in panic. And that began the tradition of people putting horseshoes over their doorway. There's all sorts of debate as to whether they're supposed to be right side up or upside down to catch the magic. But again, today we just consider them sort of superstitious, but also a sign of kind of like good luck. But this would have been considered counter magic in the 17th century. And we found them at the Chadbourne site. And again, when you find them at the location of the doors of the house, that's different than finding them out in the building behind it, which was the barn, right? So all of this is context as to where these finds are made. And again, if you think like, well, I'm sure I believe it, Tad. Well, there are enough houses that we found that actually have them still in place. Rebecca Nurse Farm is Danvers, really interesting property, one of my favorite places. And I tell people, frankly, they say, hey, Tad, I'm coming to Salem, coming in October. Where's the best place to go learn about 17th century witch trials in Salem? I said, don't go to Salem, go to Danvers. Less people there. And the Rebecca Nurse Farm actually occupied by one of the victims of Salem witch trials. Place to go. But also too, the buildings there, not just the nurse farm you can see here on the left, but also to the right is what is now a barn that they use kind of as their gift shop, but it is the frame of a 17th century house in town, the 1681 frame of the Zerubbabel Endicott house that was disassembled by Richard Trask and the volunteers at the nurse farm back in 1973 to make way for the Endicott Shopping Plaza, which is now basically, if you get off the Peabody exit off of 128 and drive by the shopping plaza that has Market Basket in it, the house sat in that plaza, right, near the front of it. And actually across the street is the old Endicott farm that still has the Endicott pear there. So this was the huge Endicott farm of which Zerubbabel was a member. And when they basically were allowed to take down this frame before they put in the shopping center. And they took part of it and used it as their barn. But when they took it down piece by piece in 1983, when they finally reconstructed it, it took it down before then. This is what it looks like when they took down the frame. And they removed the weatherboards, the clapboards, and the sheathing, and they get down to the bare frame and nailed right to the front doorway there. On one post on one side, they find a horseshoe, and on the other they find an eel spear, a trident, or as we might call it, a devil's pitchfork. So again, powerful counter magical images. And what's so wonderful about these they are buried in the walls of the house, that the carpenters, probably with the active encouragement of the Endicott family, who would have seen the construction, put them there, and then covered them over with the boards and then the clapboards to the house. So here's the deal, folks. The Endicotts, of course, are one of the leading Puritan families. Governor Endicott, this is his homestead or his property. This is his family. So these are leading Puritans, but they also wanted to cover their bets. They weren't against a little folk magic, right? I mean, yes, we're God-fearing Puritans and we go to church on Sunday, but when Reverend Paris, or whoever in 1680, it wouldn't have been Paris, it was before him. But whenever the minister comes to call, we don't want him to see this stuff. We want to bury it in the wall. So he won't chide us for having folk magic and superstitious belief, but we know it's there. And in fact, in a case about this time in Newbury, Massachusetts, there's a case of Elizabeth Morse, who people believe is a witch. And there's a neighboring house that has a horseshoe over the doorway. And one of the neighbors comes up and takes it down and says, this is counter magical and it's blasphemy and you shouldn't have it and get rid of it. And it's, lo and behold, as soon as the horseshoe's down, Elizabeth Morse comes to the house and she walks in because there's no horseshoe there, which convinced people that, yes, she was indeed a witch. And then they put the horseshoe back up and she didn't enter in the house again. So you see, she's a witch. And I realize that some of this stuff sounds almost like it's out of Monty Python, but these are the belief systems people were operating under at the time, right? And you have other concealed, oh, by the way, there's other places where they found these sorts of things too. I was talking about this artifact once at I don't think I have the image of it here. I don't. At the nurse farm. And Curtis White, who used to be the caretaker there, but now is a National Park Service guy, and I was there training his guides. He brought out an eel spear and and that had been buried inside the frame of the lean-to in the nurse farm, which built as early, I think, as the earliest it could have been built was 1729. So this stuff actually lingers well after 1692, and in fact becomes more popular after then for reasons I'll discuss later. So all sorts of other concealed objects, and again, found around the hearth. Here, iron tools, as I say, dead cats and horse skulls, garments, especially socks, shoes, mittens, gloves. And here you'll see in the Hancock Clark House, Lexington Historical Society, the parsonage there. Again, what could be a more God-fearing Christian place than the parsonage? And here, and yes, of course, the minister there, Hancock Thomas, was the grandfather of course, John Hancock. And yes, it is here that Hancock and Adams are met by Paul Revere on April 19th, saying, yeah, the British are coming. You guys need to scram and get the heck out of Dodge. And they end up going further west. But you see, buried here in this side wall here, not far from the fireplace, is this whole stack of shoes. And shoes in particular were believed, well, why shoes? Again, this goes back to sort of a medieval tradition of Sir John Shorn, who supposedly who forced the devil into a boot. Now, if you think about it, shoes are very personal objects. Old leather shoes, especially if you're not wearing socks, will conform to your feet. Frankly, will conform to your, shall we say, odor. Nothing like a good old shoe that you've been wearing for 5 or 10 years. And so if evil comes down the chimney and is seeking to harm you, it will smell you, it will see the shape of your foot, and in the shoe it goes. Now, again, I can't understand how evil can be so stupid as they can't get out of a shoe, but apparently that was difficult for evil to carry off. So you often find shoes left in front of hearths or buried in the walls around hearths to protect evil from coming down the chimney. And this is something we will come back to. But one of the better examples I know of this actually is nearby, is at Old York, where when they were redoing some work on the jail, and we're working on actually rebuilding the chimney, and it was Richard Irons and his crew, and they were up in the attic, and they looked down, and in a pocket in one of the 18th century hearths there, right above it, they found over a dozen shoes. And again, the jail was built as early as 1713, but these shoes went well throughout, I believe, throughout the 18th century, and perhaps, I'm not even sure, maybe even into the 19th century. And again, all sorts of sites in England. There are all these wonderful sites. If you just, you can look up sites in England that have whole pages of stuff, and there's books written by English experts on this. There's sort of an extensive research on this. In addition to this, old houses have marks carved or burned into the wood. Again, usually near windows or doors or the hearth. And so here you see a salt tire as a stop to a dressed beam, very late dressed beam. This is a house in Newton, built in 1729. And you can clearly see the decorative, okay, and again, it's like decorative X's. They don't have to necessarily be a salt tire in that sense. They could, if the minister walks in and says, what's this? Say, yeah, just a little decoration to dress it up, and they all kind of know that it might be Countermagic, but you can't really prove that. And also 2 burn marks in the wood too, which may have some other traditions. There's a really good book on some of these practices called Medieval Graffiti, which I highly recommend. And also Brian Hoggard, who has a whole website on this sort of work in England as well too. But essentially, I think pretty much, as I say, any colonial house in New England has some of this stuff buried in the walls or in one of the beams somewhere. It's just people have not looked for it. But there you go. You see in there's the burn mark. And the more elaborate ones that you see occasionally here are called demon traps. The most famous demon trap is at Knoll in Surrey. And particularly when they were, about 10 years ago, when they were doing some restoration work on the King's bedchamber, a room built for a visit by James V, or excuse me, James VI and first. And this is around the time of the gunpowder plot, when people are worried about the king. And this is when all the English authors, including like Middleton, The Witch, or maybe better known, this play called Macbeth, the Witches playwright, are all about the fear of witches and attacking the king. And so isn't it interesting that when they pulled up the floorboards in Knoll in the king's bedchamber, built specifically for his visit in, I believe, 1605 or 1606, they find right there on one of the sleepers, this cross-hatching, what they call a demon trap. Think of this as like a dream catcher, but for catching bad dreams, right? that somehow that once evil gets into the crosshatchings, it cannot escape. Much like a Pennsylvania hex sign too, right? Sometimes, now having said this, sometimes carpenter's marks are just carpenter's marks, right? So particularly if you see tally marks or just a couple of crosshatchings, it may not be a demon trap. To me, a lot of it depends on how elaborate it is and how close it is to a window or a door. Sometimes it will never be, never be quite sure. But again, you get up in the attic, and especially if there's a place where there was a gable that's been removed, you might see something like this. My favorite form of carving, of course, are hexafoils or daisy wheels or hexfoils as they're called. And again, usually found near openings in homes. And essentially what they are is a compass. You take a compass drawing a series of circles. Sometimes in barns, you'll see them drawn with pitchforks, same idea. And you can see the one on the left here, which is in the fireplace in the Winslow House, 1699. And this is right under the mantle, just above the hearth. So you can't miss the implications here for all to see of like evil, do not cross this path, do not leave this chimney, right? The one on the right is actually from my house. And it is in the Elevar house. It's an older mid-18th century frame probably, but it wasn't finished and egged out onto the house and finished till probably the 1820s. So this is fairly late. As you'll see, it's actually I put on the cover of my book. But again, when we bought the house back in 1997, and I saw this thing walking in the kitchen, and there it is on the woodwork, on the trim towards my office. You couldn't help but notice this thing, and I had no idea what it was. My initial reaction was that some bored kid on a rainy day took a compass and carved this design in, and then probably caught heck at the very least from his angry parents. But then I realized that after a while, we began to realize that no, actually, the parents did this to ward off evil. But stay tuned, and we'll get back to that. My favorite daisy wheel in our neighborhood, if you haven't had a chance to get into Jackson House, historic New England study house, get a chance when it's open. It's filled with Countermagic. And my favorite piece is this daisy wheel, this elaborate daisy wheel carved in the early 18th century into the partition wall, which separates the upstairs parlor into two separate rooms. So we have a bit of a date on this of when this was done. So again, we know is not original to the house. And what's interesting too is it is outside of the room that was given when the house was broken up amongst the heirs. This is on the outside of the room that was owned by John Jackson, who's described in 1769 as a person non compos mentis. In the 18th century, many people believed that demons attacked people to cause mental illnesses. So again, this was one well-intentioned members of the family's efforts to protect their loved one from mental illness, that is from attacks of demons, right? And in this case, again, it's really interesting because this is an 18th century piece. The problem with so much of this woodwork is you really don't know when it was added, right? It could have been added when the house was built. It could have been added, who knows, 30 years ago. But in this case, this appears to be pretty old carving. Again, we don't have any descriptions of this, but think of the hexafoil as something like the Pennsylvania hex symbol, right? This idea of like a circle from which evil cannot escape. And again, thank God, evil is pretty dumb. We, again, don't have full explanations of these things. Again, these are folk beliefs. And again, ones that white magic that people are kind of embarrassed to admit to. So no one publishes a guide to how to use folk magic and carvings to ward off evil, right? Again, there was no ring central manual for the 17th century. But we do have this wonderful broadside from the bishopric of Trier in 1594, basically showing like the Walpurgis knot, the night of the witches. And you can see here the witches have pretty much taken over this house and destroyed it from the back. But here all you have left is the hearth. But if you look right here, you see what's left of the hearth, and you just see all of these counter magical symbols. There's a witch coming down, a demon coming down the chimney, and you see there another one there coming down, and you see all these markings all over the place to try to prevent evil from coming down the chimney and entering the house. This is a rare indication that we actually have from the day showing something like this going back into the 16th century. But again, no one's writing down what all of these symbols and exactly how they were used. Fascinatingly, we see this not just in houses. We see this all over the place in furniture. And yes, if you want to think about it, what could be more vulnerable than a loved one in a cemetery, right? Particularly, too, remember that Puritan cemeteries are not consecrated ground. They are not enclosed in churchyards. Puritans get the heebie-jeebies over any kind of religious practices, including with their interment and religious rituals and things like this. But at the same time, it was clear that families wanted to protect their loved ones. And you see these interesting uses of daisy wheels on gravestones, particularly in Merrimack River Valley, places like the North Andover Burial Ground, over like in Haverhill, and the old Bradford Cemetery as well, and really throughout that area, Newburyport. You see the some of the stonecutters of the day in that region are carving these elaborate daisy wheels along with other rosettes and symbols into their gravestones. And I honestly think you can see them right here. You can see them here. You can see them on furniture. I honestly think that these are done. You've said, hey, well, so Tad, why would someone put that in their gravestone? Because clearly the minister's going to see it and be upset. And again, I think this is they're trying to create some elements of doubt. You know, if the minister starts to chew you out for putting daisy wheels and magic on your mother's gravestone, you say, no, you know how much mother loved daisies. And look, next to it, there's her rosettes. She loved roses too. So it's not that kind of daisy. Oh, no, we would never do that. Well, yes, you would. Yeah. And you see it everywhere else. I mean, here's this wonderful board chest, New England board chest from the second half of the 17th century, that's in the collections of the Met. And again, count them 1, 2, 3, 4 daisy wheels right there. And again, someone could say that, no, they're just, if you look at Puritan furniture of the 17th century, it's got all sorts of geometrical decorations on it. And here you see the semicircles up top. So again, you can explain this away if you want, but I think, trying to create reasonable doubt, but I think we know that this is basically there to ward off evil, and God knows what they wanted to was in the chest that they wanted to protect, right? But there you go. One of my favorite objects is at the Pickering house, the mirror, a mirror made by a member of the family, Theophilus Pickering. It's frankly one of the relatively few pieces of furniture in the house that is from the family. And on the back of it has the information on it. And also on the back, you'll see a whole bunch. There's a huge daisy wheel here. There's one up here. There's a double one here. They're all over the place. And again, mirrors, talk about something that has really all sorts of cultures have all kinds of concerns about mirrors and their ability to commune with the world of the dead or the undead. So again, to prevent evil from getting out of your mirror, you still want to have a mirror, but just in case. And by the way, you put it on the back where no one's going to see it anyhow, right? So, and again, well into the 18th century. There you go. There's one. Some examples of this. You've already seen one from my house, which we now think probably dates maybe around 1810 in York, the old Preble homestead. And again, the more I live in this place, the more Countermagic we find. And we're in the kitchen looking at that L, which is probably added in the 1820s. And yes, that's where that hexafoil is. And so, but we ended up working on this room. And well, Dan Boyle, I saw you in the audience, and you're going to see a picture of you soon. That daisy wheel is actually on the cover of my book. And then because when I figured out what it was like, oh, wow. So I happened to buy a house that's protected against magic. And so there's Dan on the left, along with Aaron Sturgis in the middle and the crew. A number of years ago, actually in the days of the Chadbourne dig, when they were working on my sills, and this whole floor was rotted and needed to be replaced under my office. And my wife would say, well, it probably had the fact that I had way too many books in there. But the simple fact we found was when they got down to remove the floorboards and did this amazing job of restoring it all back, was the fact that right in front of Aaron there is actually, so actually where this first beam is where the floor stopped. Because here we are, and right here is the large kettle they did the laundry in, and there's a cistern down here to collect water in, and here's a well. And so this is the laundry room, and you have water, a well right in that area. And so also too, that would mean why these beams tended to be damper and would rot fast than some others perhaps, right there. So if you look at that spot, that's where the wall was. And there is the well. Okay, folks, so think about this. If you're really worried about a demon coming down from the sky, that is from heaven, or knocking on the door, or coming through the door or the windows. What about having a direct passage to the underworld, a well, inside your house? So you're darn right you want to put counter magic as much as possible around this room. You want to put a hexafoil so that if the demon gets into the laundry room, they're not going to get any further out. And I know you're also thinking, like, if you get the demon in the laundry room, maybe he can do a few loads of laundry for you as well. But there were other things we found in this room too when we pulled up the floor. And the one, actually, the interesting piece was the one actually to the wall behind Dan when they lifted the house up and were doing work on it right there. You can see, as they're removing the sheathing, you can see right here the head of an axe. And it is a complete axe, and it is still pretty much razor sharp, broad axe, probably made, again, Aaron and Dan and the gang from the Timber Framers Guild, when they had their meeting in York, I brought it over and they said, oh yeah, 1820, 1830. And it's actually got a hallmark on it from the family that owned the broad axe, South Berwick family. And clearly they were doing some carpentry work when this part of the building was probably added on. And I remember actually the carpenters saying, like, yeah, they were playing a trick on the head of the crew, by burying his axe in the wall. I don't think so, folks. Again, a whole axe, razor sharp, buried in the wall, to me is like really powerful counter magic in this room that's protected by the daisy wheel and this. Oh, by the way, also we found like a glove there too. So this is, again, like this is a really strongly protected room. And I owe it to my daughter, Megan, who I was out digging at the Chadbourne site when this discovery was made. And she, no, Dad wants photographs of this before it's covered back up, and took the photographs of it in situ. So I would have a record of it. And for the record, folks, yes, we still have the broad axe. It sits in that room, basically on the wall where it was discovered, on the top of a bookcase there, and rarely leaves the room, and if so, only for a minute or two to show it to company, because not that I believe in this stuff, but why tempt fate, right? And again, the point is, belief doesn't end in 1692. If you think about it, if the Salem witch trials did anything, it convinced us that you could not detect witches, right? Increase Mather concludes in his book on the Salem witch trials, essentially says, we can't be certain, and better that 10 witches live than one innocent person die. And the Salem witch trials do not end the belief in witches. They end the belief that you can, with 100% accuracy, detect who a witch is, because by the fall of 1692, it was clear that innocent people had been accused and that innocent people had died. So here's the problem. After 1692, they stopped trying witches, but that doesn't mean people stop believing in them. So again, you need your own home security system to protect against evil entering your house and harming your house and your family. So you have to protect your house, which is why in 18th century houses, even in 19th century houses, you see forms of protective magic. And again, one of my favorites, and this is a picture I took out of Seacoast Online some years ago, when they were doing some work in the soffit in the attic of the Rate Farm in 1896 from the Rate Farm Museum in Elliott back in 2011. So this stuff could not have gotten in there before 1896, earliest, right? What did they find there? You see, again, symbolic magic. We're no longer using broad axes. We're a little more sophisticated than that, please. How about a broken 1858 Remington revolver and a powder horn to go with it, which of course, again, makes no sense with a revolver. But again, symbolically, you need to help ward off evil to fuel the gun. And then also a couple of bottles, including, yes, this one, which has, yes, a pentagram carved into the side of it. I've never been in touch with folks at the Rate Farm. I really should reach out to them. If there's any in the audience, I'd love to hear from you. My guess is I would love to do trace elemental analysis on this bottle, which is now empty. I would bet a large sum of money that this thing was one time filled with urine. Because it's, to me, I am almost certain this is a witch's bottle. So there you go. And again, I probably should get in touch with the folks at the farm and talk to them about getting this tested because, again, late 19th century. So here's the thing, folks. We still believe in it. We still live in a magical world. I mean, in this example I read about a few years ago, in 2009, the Ontario police apprehended a man who was acting very strangely. And with him, he had a plastic bottle, a gallon jug, I believe it was, filled with urine and razor blades. At which point, the police logically asked him what he was doing with this. And he said it was for protection against bad people. So we still have a witch's bottle, only it's a plastic bottle filled with urine. And in this case, we're not bothering to look for hand-forged nails or straight pins. We're just going straight to razor blades. That sharp steel to protect against evil. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. I'm just reporting it, right? So as I say, we still live in a magical world. We just don't realize it. And again, with the holidays coming up, let's think about Christmas and what it really means and how we decorate our front doors with what? Boughs of evergreens to ward off evil from coming in the door. We put boughs of evergreens, you know, wreaths across America, a wonderful Maine effort. Let's decorate these gravestones and appropriately remember our veterans. But again, if you're going back to the ancient world, we are also protecting them against evil. And when do we need to protect people most from evil? During those darkest days of the world, when it looks like light will end and the forces of darkness will take over. That's why we do this at Christmas time. That's the time of the pagan ritual of Saturnalia, right? That's not a coincidence by any stretch of the imagination. And where do we put, you know, we have the mantles with greenery, and here's our house with the Christmas tree there. And we no longer put it there because I like to have fires in the fireplace during Christmas, right? But still, you get the idea, right? This tradition goes back to the 17th century, as some of you may have started to think, oh, you mean good spirits can come down chimneys too, can't they? One of my favorite Jan Steen's paintings, and I love many of his, wonderful, basically the Polaroid moments of the 17th century, right? The Feast of St. Nicholas, the popular holiday in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Good old St. Nick comes down the chimney, and children leave their wooden shoes or their stockings that are by the fireplace to be filled with treats. And you can see here the little girl who's gotten a doll, and there's her shoe that the doll was placed in or on her wooden shoe because she was good. And her brother behind who is crying because there's his shoe that his sister has, and there's a lump of coal in it. The good old days, right? When kids actually got the lump of coal. Well, at least in paintings, right? So again, old traditions of good spirits coming down the chimney. And there's the shoe, and there's the other shoe. And so, yes, traditionally too, and again, you know, if you read about in Harry Potter, she understands this stuff when she talks about dobbies. Dobbies are house demons or brownies, elves, all these things. And you want traditional offerings for them to protect them from harming your house. You leave them treats of food. And you do the same thing for good spirits as well, too, because you want him to leave you good treats rather than lumps of coal. So hence cakes or cookie or bread or left for the good spirit as well as they are today for good St. Nick or Santa Claus. Wants to make sure that he's well fed. I've kind of wondered after a few of these stops how he's able to fit back up the chimney, but that's a story for another day. So thank you very much. And I am more than happy